I've been asked to talk about D.W.Griffith because I have worked for 4 years under him and was at one time his first assistant. I've been asked to concentrate whatever I might have to say into approximately 15 minutes. 15 hours wouldn't be enough to start. 4 years of close proximity and personal contact with Griffith gave me the opportunity to know that great man better than most of those who have worked for him. For those few, I hope, who do not know who D.W. Griffith was, I may say he was the pioneer of filmdom. He was the man who made the first great motion pictures: The Birth of a Nation, Intolerance, Broken Blossoms, Way Down East, Hearts of the World, to name only a few. He was the first man who had put beauty and poesy into a cheap and tawdry sort of amusement which some people had shamefacedly accepted while waiting for a train or to seek shelter from the inclemencies of the weather. He was the man who invented the close-up to give to the poor man the same intimate view of the interesting subject in the film as the rich man derived from looking through his opera glasses at whatever interested him on the legitimate stage. With that difference, of course, that Griffith decided what the man in the box as well as the one in nigger heaven was to see at close range and when. Whereas the highbrow could choose the attractive legs of the heroine in even the most dramatic scene if it so pleased him. The close-up of a person was to emphasize at a given moment in the play that person's thoughts, his expression, and his reaction, as the close-up of an inanimate object accentuated its dramatic importance. Griffith was the man who invented it. The money men, as well as the exhibitors, thought Griffith had gone crazy. The latter refused at first to show these stupid torsos. Who would want to watch human beings without legs? The movement was the main objective. The thought, the motoric power behind that movement was unessential. Today, almost 50 years later, his close-up is constantly and successfully used in almost every film. He was the first man who fully realized the potentialities of the motion picture. It was he who had made motion pictures the most popular and influential medium of entertainment the world has ever known. His films were the first to draw the intelligentsia to the theater. It was Griffith who first realized fully the extraordinary opportunity the motion picture afforded for the making of propaganda. It was he who made the first and most important film for the Allied cause in the First World War, Hearts of the World. It was in this film that I acted as Mr. Griffith's first and personal assistant and military expert, besides playing the part of the German officer, the outstanding villain. I had been working under Griffith since 1914, but when Griffith went to France in 17, after the entry of the United States into the war, I had lost my job and I was stranded in New York. It was winter and very cold. I had pawned my overcoat, and my only blue serge suit was awfully shiny at the elbows and the seat. I ate once in a while on the borrowed meal ticket of an actor friend. In that same restaurant, I had made the acquaintance of a very kindly old doctor by the name of Ralph. We used to have long and learned conversations. One night, I was extremely depressed talking to this doctor, informed me that he had just read about the return of D.W.Griffith from France and England, and that he was scheduled to make a great propaganda film for the Allies. Knowing that I had previously worked for Griffith, he asked me whether I wasn't going to see my former boss and offer my services. Being as depressed and disheartened as I was, I refused. But the little doctor did not accept my no for an answer. At the end of the evening, he demanded that I be in his office the next day at 2 o'clock. I decided not to go because I felt that there would be no use, and I would make myself only small in the eyes of the man whom I adored. But nevertheless, at 2 o'clock, I found myself in Dr. Rauch's office. He ordered me to take my coat off, roll up my sleeve, and without answering my questions, he gave me a shot in the arm. What it was that he had injected, I never did find out. But whatever it was, it worked. For months I hadn't dared to look at any woman because I knew I looked so shabby, and it gave me an inferiority complex. But when I crossed the street to go to Griffith's office, I noticed a beautiful blonde coming in the opposite direction. I looked at her with what I thought were devilish eyes, even turned around after her and scrutinized the shape of her legs. I realized that the doctor's injection had done something to me. I reached Griffith's office, but was stopped by an over-officious office boy. Not paying any attention to him, I simply vaulted the balustrade, went directly to Griffith's private office. His deep voice asked me to enter. I made my best kick and bow I have ever made in my life. He seemed very glad to see me. After the preliminaries, he asked me what I was getting these days, meaning what salary I was demanding. For you, Mr. Griffith, I work for a ham sandwich a day. There was a slight pause. You're leaving tonight for Los Angeles. That was the way Dr. Rauch's injection worked. And that is the way I became once more Griffith's assistant. What that film, Hearts of the World, did for the Allies has never been justly appreciated. It cost hundreds of thousands of men and women of more or less pro-German audiences in the United States to have a complete change of heart, and the Teutonic arrogance and brutality exposed in that film caused many a man to go home, to melt his baby cradle, to make a trench knife out of it, and to enlist in the army. It was Griffith who first realized the necessity of music, and especially mood-setting music, as accompaniment to films. And it was he himself who composed most of the stirring music of his films. It was Griffith who first felt the sacred duty to show everything, may it be sets, costumes, uniforms, customs, or rituals, as correctly as humanly possible, even at that early stage when it was not so easy to conform with actuality and the truth of things as it is nowadays. It was he who fully realized the educational values of the film and felt personally responsible for the authenticity of everything in them. It was D.W.Griffith who first and fully realized the psychological effect of a proper and correct costume on the actor. It was he who insisted, for instance, on a real consecrated pyx being in the hand of the prison chaplain who accompanied Bobby Harron to the gallows in the famous film Escape. That actor, carrying that pyx, felt as much as a priest as if ordained. It was D.W. who invited famous stage stars of that time to contribute their histrionic ability to films for the betterment of that entertainment. Sir Herbert Beerbohm-Tree, Constance Collier, Douglas Fairbanks, to mention only three. It was Griffith who, through this move, put the motion picture on the same level with the best productions of the legitimate stage. If Griffith had not been the greatest motion picture director of all times, he could have become a great poet, a great commander of armies, perhaps even a pope. But without doubt, great in any endeavor. If you live in France, for instance, and you have written one good book, or painted one good picture, or directed one outstanding film 50 years ago, and nothing ever since, you are still recognized as artist and honored accordingly. People take their hats off and call you mad. They do not forget. In Hollywood, you're as good as your last picture. If you didn't have one in production within the last 3 months, you're forgotten, no matter what you have achieved. Hear this. It is that terrific, unfortunately necessary egotism in the makeup of the people who make cinema. It is that continuous endeavor for recognition, that continuous struggle for survival and for supremacy among the newcomers that relegate the old-timers to the ash can. D.W. did not have a last picture, not of late. The last one he did have had not turned out so well. The producer who sponsored that opus had misgivings from the beginning. Griffith was in financial stress when friends engineered this undertaking for him. In the past, Griffith had been too great, too big, too independent for the film financiers, but this time they were determined to outwit him. They had the story all ready, the shooting script all ready, the sets all ready. Everything was ready. They were afraid that the great master would overstep in his imperious way their schedule and their budget. Griffith's heart had been almost broken by his previous bitter experiences. So the ungratefulness and selfishness of their campaign made him lose heart completely. Lesser men were afraid that the master's method might be out of date, so they gave him new blood to put in what the new times demanded. He, the man who had written all of his film stories himself, in his mind only, because Griffith never used one page of script in all his films, was to megaphone a story with which he had nothing to do personally. So to say, a mental hamburger, preconceived, prearranged, and almost pre-digested. Griffith did what he could. in the circumstances, just to fulfill his contractual obligations. But naturally, it was not a success worthy of a Griffith. So the greatest man the cinema had or will ever have died practically poor and a forgotten man. He died in the heart of the most heartless town in the world, Hollywood. He passed away mourned only by those few who had the chance to work for him, no matter in what menial capacity that might have been. In 1914, I had the honor of sweeping his stages at the old barns on Prospect Avenue in Hollywood that served as the Reliance Majestic Studio, literally with a broom. In short order, I became extra man, the Hollywood term for supernumerary, played bits, worked myself up to small parts, and the eyes of D.W. fell on me, and I was engaged as assistant director to John Emerson, the former famous stage director, under the personal auspices of Griffith. In 1917, when, as I said before, when Griffith returned from the front where he had been induced to make a propaganda film for the Allied cause, he selected me as his personal first assistant. It was this great film, Hearts of the World, in which I also played the German officer. In that capacity of Griffith's assistant and actor, I had the opportunity to become personally acquainted with the man, Griffith. I've met thousands and thousands of people in my life, but I have yet to meet an equal to D.W., as he was called by his subjects endearingly. His enemies, and there were many, called him Hook-Nosed Dave. Nearly tall, always slender, even with advancing years, with those sharply hewn features, the aquiline nose, the nearly bald pate, the over-prominent lower lip, and wrapped in a white toga, he could have magnificently impersonated a Roman senator. Paradoxically, this finely constructed, sensitive, aesthetic man who has given the world the first film poetry, this sculptor of outstanding and everlasting screen characters, had a deplorable penchant for loud, checkered, almost touty suits and overcoats, and ever so broadly striped silk shirts and floppy Panama hats of gigantic size. But had he had overalls on, he would have attracted everyone's attention because he had what we call allure. His walk was of a majestic cadence. I have never seen him to hurry. He never drove a car himself. He told me once that otherwise he would have been constantly in jail or in the hospital. Perhaps it was the former actor in him that made him behave as he did, that made him do and say things as he did, realizing that 100 eyes were always watching him and 100 ears were listening. His voice was deep and mellow, and he spoke slowly with pauses between each word, as if he would search for them. All his disciples tried to ape him, as much as they could. Some of us achieving a second-rate imitation of his voice and his utterances. Some of us, those who had enough money, sported striped shirts. A few even crowned themselves with Panamas. Never once, even at nerve-straining moments during battle scenes, with earth-shaking explosions roaring around him, set off in the midst of attacking masses, with real casualties lying about the battlefield, bleeding, waiting patiently and gladly so as to have D.W. get his scene, have I heard Griffith raise his voice. Even his imperious command to cut was said in a low voice, only understandable to his assistants, who then repeated it so that the masses could hear. Never have I heard him use a swear word or any vulgar expression so frequent in the vocabulary of motion picture directors. Never have I seen him in anger, at least never outwardly. And heaven and I know there were many occasions for him to be angry, even with me. As all great men, he surrounded himself with capable personnel. I was one of them. Men who worked for him day and night with little sleep and little food, for little money, for months and months. Not because he made them work like that, but because they wanted to. To be working for D.W.Griffith at that time was the topmost honor that could be possibly conferred upon anyone in Hollywood. It meant prestige. It was the social saison. It meant the chance around the corner. It meant everything. There was nothing small in that man's makeup. Even the smallest thing took on dimensions. Generous to a fault, he died poor, as it behooves an artist. I happen to know that once, I think it was in 23, he had deposited $37,000 in the safe of the Alexandria Hotel in Los Angeles, where he had lived for years. 4 years later, they found the deposit and notified Griffith. He had forgotten all about it. Not that he had so much money that he could afford to forget that amount. No. But money meant little to him, unless it was to spend it in great style. He never gave less than a $5 gold piece as a tip, even for the smallest service rendered. Of course, that was in that good old time when we all got paid in gold, in California at least, and when Griffith was at his height. But even when he had to battle for his existence, he was always overgenerous. The type of woman he loved was the ethereal type, like Lillian Gish. He loved to dance. I believe that is what kept him young. Griffith was not a man to inspire intimacy. There was always a certain distance between him and his employees and co-workers, which he, with all his kindness and human understanding, knew how to preserve without becoming snobbish. One can imagine how I felt when he visited me in 1941, 25 years after I had left his service, in my little shabby dressing room in the theater in Philadelphia, where I played in Arsenic and Old Lace during my tour through the United States. My role was very exacting, physically at least, and I perspired freely. I was just getting a rub down after the last act when the door opened and D.W. entered. He kissed me on both cheeks. I've received quite a few honors in my life, but that kiss of the master was the highest honor that could be bestowed on me. So long, master. So long, D.W.